Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and today we will take a look at the agenda of the US-India meet, a look at Libya's peace process, and we go over to Australia hosting the 2026 Commonwealth Games. Now, our top story is Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the US President Joe Biden met virtually on Monday morning. The External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Defense Minister Rajnath Singh were in Washington for the fourth 2+2 Foreign and Defense Ministry dialogues with their US counterparts. The war between Russia and Ukraine featured prominently in the opening remarks of both. Now let's go over to Prashant, who could tell us a little bit more about what was this meeting all about.
Right, Swastika. So, of course, there are two sets of meetings we need to analyze here. One is the Joe Biden Narendra Modi meeting, of course. India and US, of course, partners for a long time, especially strong partners, but this partnership facing a bit of a crisis due to the ongoing Ukraine war. The second meeting is what is called the 2+2 dialogues, where the foreign and defense ministers of both countries meet. So, that was also being held in this context. Now, like I said, the overarching theme of this discussion has been the Ukraine war, where India and the United States have clearly quite different positions. Now, the United States and its allies, of course, as we know, have taken a very hardline position.
Yes.
They've been trying to put sanctions on Russia. They've been trying to restrict Russia's sale of oil and other essentials. India, on the other hand, has struck a different path, so to speak, where it has actually said it has increased its purchase of Russian oil, still not as much as some of what the European countries are consuming in terms of energy, but it has increased its purchase nonetheless. And this is something that the United States is very unhappy with, because if you look at the other allies of the Quad, which the US had formed, that is Australia and Japan, they have been very enthusiastic and interested in sanctioning Russia. On the other hand, India has kind of held off. Joe Biden has called India's position shaky, actually. So this is the larger context in which this is happening. And what the US has been trying to do continuously in meeting after meeting, we saw that recently Dilip Singh, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, he had come to New Delhi. Earlier, Victoria Nuland from the State Department had come to New Delhi. So in all these meetings, there is an attempt to sort of try to pressurize India. They're saying very clearly that this is not pressurizing. They're not calling for a definite ask, so to speak. It's all candid, friendly conversations, nothing adversarial. That's what the US is saying. But clearly what they're trying to do is to try to convince India to reduce the purchase of Russian energy, to draft India, so to speak, into maintaining this kind of cordon of pressure alongside Russia, because what India does could be a model for many countries in Africa and Latin America as well. So that is a larger context in which these discussions have happened. We haven't seen a real change in India's position so far, but I think the US will continue to apply pressure.
Actually, let's go into India's position with Russia and its ties, considering right now it is feeling the pressure to toe US's line.
Right. So we've talked about this before. There's a long history of collaboration in the military aspect. For instance, a lot of India's military infrastructure is imported from Russia. On the other hand, if you look at oil supplies, there is a small component which again is brought from Russia. In terms of fertilizer supplies, there's a vital aspect to it. In terms of strategic affairs, also Russia is very important for India, because it, in some senses, is the player whom India can depend on to have some kind of a position in Central Asia, because India and China do share an adversarial relationship at this point, with Pakistan, of course. So when it comes to a place like Afghanistan, for instance, Russia is essential for India to sort of have an entry point into the region as a whole. Okay. So keeping all this in mind, Russia is both economically and strategically a very vital partner as far as India is concerned. And that is why India is very reluctant to cut off those ties entirely. So India is not openly taking Russia's side, of course. It is abstained at meeting after meeting of the United Nations and its various bodies when it comes to condemning Russia. And a similar position has been taken by countries, for instance, like South Africa or many others. India maybe rhetorically has taken a slightly more neutral position than some other countries. It is always kept calling for peace, kept calling for negotiations. It expressed concern over the recent killings, of course, in Ukraine. But in general, it has taken, even rhetorically, a very careful position. And yet at times it is even sought to point out the hypocrisy of the West. For instance, I think S. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, said that India has purchased less oil, less energy supplies than what Europe purchases in an afternoon. So his point was that there's a lot of hypocrisy here in the United States and the European countries asking others not to purchase energy from Russia when they themselves, the European countries especially, are consuming huge amounts. So this is a position India has taken, a very important position globally, and will actually determine quite a lot of what might happen in the coming weeks and months as well, especially if this conflict drags out for a long time. And we see the settling in of some of these sanctions, because that is what sanctions do. They kind of settle in, they become the norm, right? So what the United States wants primarily is for a lot of countries to basically agree to enforce this norm.
Yes.
And like I said, to basically encircle Russia in some ways with this web of sanctions, with this web of expropriations and seizing of assets. And they want India to be a player in this, even if it's on a mild. So while the US is saying that we understand India's ties with Russia, while they're not concretely applying massive pressure right now, there is a sustained pressure to try to move India in that direction over the coming months and years. So that's the larger ball game here. The Indian establishment has a very careful, line, a very careful line it has to consider. How much on, how much to give into, how much to give into the pressure, how much to stay defiant. Do they make concessions, to the US in some other ways? All this remains to be seen, because we do know that this partnership is also important for India. It's not that, the establishment right now is saying that, okay, we are done with the US and its allies. They very clearly want in this partnership, but they have to also make sure that they do not distance the Russians completely. So very careful at a crucial time as far as India is concerned.
Well, a fine line to toe for India for sure. Thank you for joining us with those details, Prashant. There appears to be fresh rifts among the political class in Libya, threatening the peace process. Fathi Bashaga expressed his desire to take control over the government in Tripoli on Tuesday, almost a month after he was elected by the Libyan parliament to lead the interim government. Now, the Libyan parliament had sacked the government of national unity headed by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibah last month, claiming it failed to execute its mandate to hold national elections. However, Dbeibah has refused to step down. Now, Bashaga's statement comes at a time when there appears to be uncertainty about the unity of Libya's armed forces as well. Members of the Eastern Command of the Joint Military Commission, which was created to coordinate the armed forces in the country following the UN-sponsored talks last year, have already announced on Saturday suspension of their participation in the commission. To know more about this, let's go over to Abdul. Abdul, now over to you to talk about what is happening in Libya at this moment.
Well, in Libya, the situation is becoming, you can say, complicated again. Because there are two governments at this moment. The second government, which is led by Fathi Bashaga, was elected last month by the Libyan parliament, and now he is claiming that he basically the government led by the Dbeibah should resign and hand over the power to him. But the Dbeibah has refused to hand it over, claiming that he is the legitimate prime minister because he was basically elected by the UN-led peace Libyan political dialogue forum. So that is one part. The second part is the Joint Military Commission, which was created following the UN-led peace negotiations last year. Has also, there is a sign of kind of division in it. The 5+5, the 5 journals from the West and 5 journals from the East. As we know, the Libya, due to the war, has been divided into 2 different parts. Eastern part controlled by Khalifa Haftar's forces, and the western part, quote unquote, was controlled by the government of national accord. So in order to create a peace situation in Libya after the ceasefire, there was a joint military commission created by the UN led after the talks, in which 5 members were represented from the Western government and 5 from the Eastern government. Now, on Saturday, the 5 generals from the eastern side have announced that they will no longer be participating in the Joint Commission meetings, claiming that until the government hands over the power to the legitimate government, they will not be cooperating. Though there are other talks about salaries being not paid and other grievances being the point, but largely it is a political issue. They have also raised, the 5 commanders have also raised the issue of, they have asked, in fact, the army to block the road which basically connects the eastern part of the country to the western part. They have also asked the Khalifa Haftar-led forces to stop all kinds of production and export of the oil from the country. So these are the major, you can say, kind of setbacks for the larger peace talks which were going on in Libya. Yeah.
Staying with the peace talks, Abdul, the standoff between the two governments in Libya, is it now endangering the peace talks that have finally come to a place?
Uh, it looks that way at this moment. As we all know, the war in Libya started after the NATO-led invasion in 2011. Basically destabilized the country. Libya, which is was one of the richest and most developed country in Africa, has become a kind of a war zone. Different parties controlling different parts of the country, particularly the major division, as we discussed before, between the East and West. The parliament itself, which was elected after the UN-led intervention in 2014, is now divided between the High Council of States and the House of Representative based in the eastern part in Tobruk, and the HCS based in the Tripoli, capital of Libya. So the current developments which has happened in last, say, 1.5 months, primarily after the Beba government failed, which is an interim government. Its mandate was, under the UN-led peace negotiations, its mandate was to kind of conduct the elections, national elections, and the time frame was December last year. Yes. December. It did not happen, and therefore after that the parliament, particularly the eastern part of the parliament, the House of Representatives, has came out heavily against the Beba government, not only accusing it of failing to execute the mandate, UN peace negotiations mandate, but also basically indulging in corruption and power grab. So given this larger political allegations between the main centers of power in Libya at this moment, and the failure of the UN to kind of have the kind of influence it had a year and a half back, because the UN representative, which is now called the special advisor to UN Secretary General Stephen Williams, she is a contested figure herself, because the external forces which are involved in Libya at this moment, Russia and the United States of America, are basically divided on her position in Libya. So and that basically has impact on the other parties which are there in Libya as well. Okay. So given the problems with the UN's legitimate role in the peace negotiations at this moment, and given the divide between both the major factions, ruling classes in Libya, which at last year it had agreed to come together, now seems there is no common ground. I think at this moment the peace negotiations in Libya is under trouble. We don't know what exactly will happen, but it seems that way at this moment. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us with those details, Abdul. We'll keep tracking this story and we'll come back to you for more. Let's get into our next story. For our last story, the Australian state of Victoria announced Tuesday that it will host the 2026 Commonwealth Games, with all sporting events taking place outside of the state capital, Melbourne. It will be the 6th time that Australia has staged the Commonwealth Games and the 2nd time in Victoria after Melbourne hosted the 2006 events. We are joined by Leslie, who will tell us more about the Commonwealth Games that are up ahead. Leslie, thank you for joining us. Actually, if you could tell us the relevance of Commonwealth Games as of today, in today's time.
As a multi-sport event, Commonwealth Games is pretty relevant in that sense because it falls right in the middle of an Olympic cycle. And when you look at all the nations that are taking part and the disciplines, there are many world-class events that are part of the Commonwealth Games program. For instance, athletics or swimming or badminton, shooting, cycling. So all these are the winners of Commonwealth Games generally go on to win a medal or even win gold at the Olympics. For instance, Neeraj Chopra of India, he was a Commonwealth Games champion last time around in 2018, and then he went on to win the Olympic gold in javelin in Tokyo as well. So in that sense, it gives the athletes a sort of like a performance benchmark between two Olympic Games, and their preparation for a games start from the end of the previous games, right? So in that sense, it is pretty relevant performance-wise in that. but at the same time, there is the perks attached with winning medals at the Commonwealth Games in a country like India, for instance, where awards and rewards come with it, and that also for promotions for athletes who are in common service. So these things all matter. So as a games, it makes sense. But there are many other factors which come into play as well, because in a normal sporting calendar, every discipline, every sport has their own structure, league. For instance, badminton, it has a world league that happens through the year. World tour events happen through the year that gives them ranking points and also a career, because there are prize money involved. And so these players, these athletes compete through the year. And so whether a multi-sport discipline is needed for the athletes to check their progress into an Olympic cycle is the question now. Because the larger problem facing not just the Commonwealth Games or the Asian Games, even the Olympic movement, is that the feasibility of the games itself, the economic feasibility as such, because these are major tournaments that are being staged. So when we are looking at the relevancy of Commonwealth Games, we should also consider all the major factors that are involved, including the calendar of the athletes, including calendar of the individual disciplines, and also whether it makes sense for it to be staged at a grand level.
In fact, it gets me to the next question. You mentioned this, the economics of hosting a multi-sport event. How does that really play out? Does it mean that now countries like India, Australia, UK and Canada are going to be the ones that host Commonwealth Games?
I mean, that has been the trend, sadly, because when we look at the Commonwealth Games across history, not just recent years, across history, we have had no takers from Africa. Africa has never hosted the Commonwealth Games, despite South Africa being a large sporting presence. I mean, a country with a large sporting tradition and hosting tradition also, because they have hosted the Football World Cup, Rugby World Cup, Cricket World Cup. So they have proven credentials as a host nation for sporting events, but still they haven't been a host of the Commonwealth Games. In fact, the 2022 edition, which is being staged in Birmingham later this year, was supposed to be staged in Durban in South Africa, but Durban pulled out because of economic issues. So the reality of any major sporting spectacle, including Olympic Games, is that the host nation, host city suffers. They don't break even, they don't gain also. Of course, revenue comes in, expenditure is also there. You look at a larger picture, the cities justify the spend by looking at the largest picture, that infrastructure was developed, new technology have come into the existing infrastructure of the cities, be it transport, be it sporting facilities. So all these are gains of that city, but financially they take a hit. And this has been the trend since 1980s, where every year the competitive nature of hosting the games was such that every year the hosts were competing to outdo the previous hosts. So, and that is adding to the expense as well. So right now there has been a rethink of how to stage these events. So the 2026 edition that has been awarded to, that has gone to Victoria State in Australia. So Victoria State is hosting usually the trend is that a city hosts the event. Like for instance, 2010 Delhi hosted all the games disciplines. But now Victoria State will host the event in 4 different centers, cities in the state, not just one, Melbourne, which is the capital of Victoria. So in that sense, they are trying to spread out the development perks that comes with the Commonwealth Games and also spread its reach to a larger audience, thereby expecting footfall from audience or fans coming into the stadium. Also, local sponsors being interested in this. All these factors are being considered. So this is a model that's been worked out in various levels. For instance, the European Football Championship this year is hosted by different cities, in different countries, in fact, and multi-countries for continental events has been a reality earlier as well. So the rethink in Commonwealth Games this year, like 2026, there was no other bidders. Only Australia bid for it. So that's a red signal, in fact, that no country are coming forward for it. Forget, like you mentioned, New Zealand, Australia, England, and India. nobody is coming forward. And one person one nation came in, and they got the city. And
They
then
got the bid.
for the next tournament, again the same question comes in, whether it is feasible, whether it makes sense. So we think at all level, not just the Commonwealth Games level, on how to stage these multi-sport events in the future, considering the prevalent economic factors involved. And with the pandemic, there is this possibility of remote staging and spectators coming in, tuning in from all over the world. And all that. So there has been a cultural change in how sport is being consumed, if you ask me. So in that sense, there is a brilliant window of opportunity for these organizers to explore avenues where these games, which are very important as far as sporting calendar, athletic excellence, everything is concerned, can be staged in a way where it doesn't burn holes in the pocket of the countries involved or the stakeholders who come in to do that. Nobody is shy to jump in and host this event. So that is important for the sustenance of sport in general in a larger sense, right? So that makes sense. So that meeting should happen, and ideally in the next 10 years we might see changes in how hosts and organizers approach such games.
Thank you, Leslie, for telling us those details. Well, that's all that we have from our team at Daily Debrief. Do keep following People's Dispatch and come back tomorrow. Thank you.